But that's the financial regulation, and we will get, that's a very high priority for next year. We go back to housing. I mentioned that thanks to Chairman Bernanke, after the House acted, we will not have the subprime exposure next year irresponsibly. People then say, well, what about low-income people being able to get houses? Well, the lower-income people who've been getting subprime loans fall into two categories. People who should have gotten loans and people who should not have gotten loans. And let me begin, because one of the things that's happened is this confusion. And some of my conservative friends were responsible for this. There was a conflation of the notion of people having decent homes with the notion of people owning homes. And there was an implicit view that the only kind of good housing for people, including low-income people, was one that they owned. And I believe we pushed people into home ownership who shouldn't have been there. And I've been told, well, gee, that's kind of harsh. Don't you think it'd be a good idea if everybody could own a home? Well, I think it would be wonderful if I could eat more and not gain weight. But in those moments when I act on that, it ain't so good. That's what happened to subprime loans. Yes, there are a large number of people who are not making a lot of money, who should be owning homes, who are careful and prudent and can show you how they can do this. One of the things we have done this year, and it was referenced in the introduction, was to expand the capacity of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. Look, the people who were in power for the last 8 years in the administration believed in the private sector and not the public sector. At first, they shrank the FHA. It went from something like 700,000 loan guarantees in 2002 to less than 300,000 loan guarantees per year in 2006. The president, to his credit, said, no, that's not a good idea. Let's reverse course. He asked Congress to expand the capacity of the FHA, to give them more discretion to make loans, not to exclude people by some arbitrary rule, but to look. The FHA is not a charity. You have to show the FHA that you can make those payments, and if you don't, you miss the payments, we take your house. This is not a one-sided deal. But it is a good deal. It's a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage for low-income people if they qualify. So what we have done now, because Congress passed that bill this year, the House passed it last year, it's part of the overall housing bill. We're now in a situation where, of the people who used to get subprime loans that were irresponsible and caused problems and wound up in foreclosure, many of them will now be able to get loans from the FHA, a government entity, that will check them out and then insure the loan over the interest rate. It'll be privately lent, but publicly guaranteed. And then other people will not get loans because they should not, because they are not economically, and in some cases, to be honest, socially, at the point where home ownership is appropriate for them. Now, many of us have been making that point. I continuously argued with some of my friends, some liberal friends, a lot of conservative friends, that they were exaggerating the role of home ownership. And that now leads, again, to the CRA issue. Nothing in the CRA mandated that people make irresponsible loans. And in fact, if the Chairman of the Federal Reserve had done what we wanted and promulgate rules against irresponsible subprime loans, we wouldn't have the problem. Proof of this? Community Investment Act was passed in 1977, led by Bill Proxmire. For about 25 years, nobody even hinted that it was causing these kind of problems. Well, maybe some people hinted. In 1995, as a minority member of the Financial Services Committee, I asked Federal Reserve Governor Larry Lindsey, who was in charge of that under that administration, and Larry Lindsey was a Reagan and Bush appointee. He was later fired by the current President Bush for being wildly inaccurate in his estimate of what the Iraq War was going to cost. He said it was going to cost $100 billion, and they fired him for exaggerating and being way too high. But in 1995, this conservative Republican, man of integrity, I asked him at a hearing if CRA was causing these kind of problems. He said no, and he followed up with a letter. As of 1995, 18 years after the CRA was passed, saying it is not the cause of any of these kinds of problems that people have said. Now, it is true, today, the picture with low-cost loans is different. But it wasn't CRA that caused them, it was the proliferation of non-regulated entities making irresponsible subprime loans, and the overwhelming majority of them were outside of CRA. Yes, some banks did buy some of those loans with their CRA obligation, but they never would have been made in the first place if we'd had the appropriate regulation. The next point is, what about home ownership? And you're in public life, you want to defend yourself against unfair accusations. People say to me, well, you with your concern for housing for lower income people, you're one of the reasons that we got all these subprime loans. Now, I felt that was a little unfair because I was trying very hard to have them outlawed. But I guess you could say, well, yeah, but knowing they weren't outlined, why were you pushing, for instance, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to do more for lower-income people? And I was, I'm guilty. I was pushing them to do more, essentially, for rental housing. And part of the problem we had over the last 12 years, well, from 1995 to 2006, when my Republican colleagues were in power, was they did not believe in federal programs to help construct rental housing, particularly for families. From 95 to 2006, the HUD programs for helping families get housing consisted essentially of annual Section 8 certificates. That is, a certificate given to a tenant to pay for the rent for 1 year. We used to have, before they changed the law, project-based certificates, where you could get a certificate that for 20 years guaranteed you the rental difference for low-income people, and you could literally take that to the bank and get a loan. But you can't get a loan to build a building on an annually renewed certificate. The bank wouldn't lend you, and they'd be in trouble with the regulators if they did. Now, the problem, of course, was that when we had these Section 8 certificates, the annual ones, as the only way to help low-income families, we achieved some equity, and I was in favor of it, but at a price. Basic free market economics. What we did with Section 8 certificates and no housing production programs was to add to the demand for housing in a way guaranteed not to increase the supply. And when you add to the demand and you leave the supply constant, you put an upward pressure on rental prices. Part of the subprime crisis was, one, we shut down the FHA, or mostly. We didn't regulate the non-regulated institutions, and we stopped building affordable rental housing. I went to Minneapolis at the request of my colleague Keith Ellison, the congressman, a year and a half ago, a year and 2 months ago, to talk about the subprime crisis. And as will happen, the various organizations there put forward some people to illustrate the problem. One man, they had 4 witnesses, I assume he was representative. He said, well, my wife and I got evicted, and we couldn't find another place to rent, so we bought a house. That house was in foreclosure. What a surprise. And again, it was many of us, and when I was told, well, you were pushing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Yes, not primarily to fund subprime loans. Remember, they don't originate loans, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They bought up other loans. What I wanted them to do was to do more affordable housing, multiple family housing. And ironically, the people who shut down affordable rental housing and refused to regulate subprime lending are now blaming the CRA for the bad subprime loans that were made by the entities not covered by CRA to people who couldn't find a decent place to rent. Now, yes, CRA was not a perfect instrument, but it was not the cause of the problems. It was the subprime lending that was the cause, and then these sophisticated financial instruments that multiplied it. Similarly with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Yes, they were damaged, and I underestimated the damage that was going to apply to them through the subprime loans. I also underestimated the damage that would apply to Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Wachovia, Washington Mutual, AIG. And the fact is that none of us really foresaw 5 years ago the extent to which, as I said, the subprime cancer would just spread so rapidly throughout the system. But my problem with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was that they weren't doing enough for affordable housing in the rental area. And in fact, one of the things I have been accused of, and look, you're in public life, you have to explain yourself. People said, well, why didn't you regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac all those years? Well, I have a very simple answer. I was in the minority. I didn't regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for the same reason I didn't stop the impeachment of Bill Clinton, prevent the Iraq War, keep the Patriot Act from being passed, or stop tax cuts for people with a lot of money. I didn't have the votes. The Republicans rarely got my permission before they decided to do something or not do something. I did become the chairman in 2007, and one of the first things we did was to increase the regulation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac exactly as the Secretary of the Treasury wanted us to do, and I have a lot of respect for him. And as part of the bill, we added an affordable housing trust fund. And that was our approach to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Rather than increase the pressure on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy up the loans that were made to people who couldn't repay the mortgage, What I prefer to do, and this was what we began in 2005, we were pushing for an affordable housing trust fund. Actually, we started for it in 2003. We wanted to let Fanny and Freddy be profitable, not put a lot of pressure on them in their mortgage purchases in their basic business, but then take some of the profit generated from that and put it into a rental housing fund.